The prison had no guards. The walls were high, but the gate was open. No chains held the people inside. No law forbade them from leaving. No punishment waited beyond the door. And yet, for 30 years, no one had escaped. At first, this seemed impossible. Every prisoner could see the opening. Sunlight passed through it each morning. Wind entered from the fields beyond the walls. Sometimes birds flew directly over the gate, disappeared into the distance, and returned hours later, unharmed. The prisoners watched them carefully. Then they returned to their routines. Each morning, they woke at the same hour. They stood in the same lines. They ate at the same tables. They performed tasks that no one had assigned and followed rules that no one remembered creating. The oldest prisoners said the customs had always existed. The younger prisoners assumed there must be a reason. And whenever someone asked why no one simply walked through the gate, the answers came quickly. It is probably dangerous outside. If leaving were safe, someone would have done it already. The gate may be open, but perhaps that is part of the trap. Besides, we have everything we need here. No one knew who had first spoken these words, but repetition had given them the appearance of wisdom. Over time, the prisoners stopped describing the enclosure as a prison. They called it the settlement, then the community. Eventually, they called it home. They divided the courtyard into neighborhoods. They painted the walls. They argued over which cells were most desirable and which families had lived closest to the food supply for the greatest number of years. A man who possessed 2 blankets was considered successful. A man who slept near the gate was considered strange. The people developed customs, ranks, ceremonies, and honors. Once each year, they held a celebration of freedom. They sang songs about the dignity of the human spirit while standing only a few steps from the open door. One afternoon, a young man approached the gate. He had spent years studying it from a distance. He had watched the grass move beyond the walls. He had noticed that rain fell outside, just as it did within. He had seen animals cross the opening without injury. He finally concluded that the danger might not be real. As he walked toward the exit, conversation stopped. Every face turned toward him. "Where are you going?" someone asked. "Outside." The word disturbed them. An older man stepped forward. "You should think carefully." "I have. No one knows what is beyond the walls. That is why I am going to look." The prisoners began gathering around him. One warned him about hunger. Another warned him about loneliness. A third reminded him that the settlement had protected his family for generations. Then, a woman asked the question that finally stopped him. "Do you believe you are wiser than all of us?" The young man looked at the crowd. Their expressions were not angry. They were frightened. But because every person displayed the same fear, it began to resemble certainty. Perhaps they knew something he did not. Perhaps the gate had remained unused for a reason. Perhaps the fact that no one had left was itself evidence that leaving was foolish. He took one final look at the sunlight beyond the entrance. Then he returned to the courtyard. The crowd welcomed him back. They praised his maturity. They called his surrender wisdom. That evening, the young man received more approval than he had ever known, and the gate remained open. This was how the prison survived. Not because the walls were impossible to cross, not because armed men defended the entrance. The prison survived because each person looked to the others before trusting what he could see with his own eyes. When one prisoner felt afraid, he saw 99 others standing still and assumed their stillness must be knowledge. But each of the 99 was making the same mistake. Every person believed the group possessed a certainty that existed in none of its members. Their fear circulated between them until it no longer felt like fear. It felt like reality. The prisoners did not remain because they had discovered that the world outside was dangerous. They remained because no one wished to be the first person proven wrong, and being wrong alone appeared worse than remaining miserable together. Years passed. The young man became old. He eventually began warning others not to approach the gate, not because he had learned anything new about the outside world, but because every person is tempted to defend the sacrifices he was too afraid to refuse. If another prisoner walked out safely, then his own lost years would become impossible to ignore. The departure of one man would not merely challenge the rules of the settlement. It would expose the possibility that the others had been free all along. That possibility was unbearable. So the prisoners began treating anyone interested in the gate as a threat. They called such people irresponsible, ungrateful, selfish, dangerous. Anyone who questioned the enclosure was accused of attacking the community. The people no longer merely feared leaving. They had built their identities around staying. Inside the walls, every failure had an explanation. The walls were too high. The rules were too strict. The food was too scarce. The leaders were incompetent. Life had been imposed upon them. But outside the gate, these explanations would lose their power. A free man could no longer blame the prison for every direction he refused to walk. That was the deeper terror waiting beyond the doorway. Responsibility. The gate did not merely lead into an unknown world. It led into a life in which their choices would belong to them. Inside the enclosure, they could complain without acting. They could dream without risking failure. They could imagine themselves courageous because circumstances had supposedly prevented them from proving it. The prison protected them from danger, but it also protected them from discovering who they really were. This is why an open door can frighten a person more than a locked one. A locked door preserves innocence. It allows a man to say, "I would leave if I could." An open door asks a more painful question: why haven't you? The prisoners had mistaken the ability to choose for the strength to choose well. They possessed external freedom, but over the years their habits had formed something inside them. Each repeated surrender made the next surrender easier. Every day they remained, staying felt more natural. Every day they avoided uncertainty, uncertainty appeared more dangerous. The actions they repeated were no longer merely things they did. They were becoming the kind of people they were. This is how habit works. At first, a person chooses an action. Later, the action begins shaping the person who chooses. A single act of avoidance feels insignificant, but repeated avoidance trains the soul to flee. A single compromise appears temporary, but repeated compromise teaches a person to experience weakness as personality. Eventually, he says, "This is simply who I am." But often, what he calls identity is only a pattern he has practiced for too long. The prison was built one decision at a time, and because no single decision had created it, no prisoner felt responsible for its existence. They waited for a dramatic rescue. They imagined that freedom would arrive as an event. The walls would collapse. A leader would command them to leave. A guard would appear and officially announce that the gate was safe. But no rescue came. The door had already opened. What remained was not a change in circumstances. It was an act of will. One morning, a small child appeared beyond the gate. The prisoners had never seen him before. He walked through the opening without hesitation. The courtyard became silent. The child looked around at the painted walls, the organized cells, and the people standing in their familiar lines. Then he asked, "Why are all of you in here?" An older prisoner answered immediately, "We cannot leave." The child turned and looked at the open gate. "Yes, you can." The prisoners became uncomfortable. "It is complicated," another said. "The outside is dangerous. You are too young to understand." The child considered this. Then he asked, "Have any of you ever gone outside?" No one answered. They had built their entire world around conclusions that no one had tested. They had inherited fear, repeated it, decorated it with respectable language, and passed it to their children as wisdom. The child walked back through the gate. Nothing happened to him. He crossed the field and disappeared over the hill. For several minutes, the prisoners stood motionless. They had witnessed what they claimed was impossible. But even then, most remained. Because evidence can expose a prison without giving a person the courage to leave it. Truth can reveal the door. It cannot walk through the door on your behalf. Near sunset, one woman stepped away from the crowd. She was not the bravest among them. Her hands shook as she approached the entrance. She did not know what waited beyond the walls. She did not know where she would sleep. She did not know whether she would succeed. But she had finally understood something. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to treat fear as the final authority. She crossed the threshold. The prisoners watched. Nothing struck her. No hidden guard appeared. The world did not end. She took several steps into the field, stopped, and looked back. The others expected her to call them. She did not. No one could make the decision for them. Some condemned her. Some pitied her. Some insisted she would return. But a few began moving toward the gate, not because the outside had become safe. It had never promised safety. They moved because remaining had finally become more frightening than leaving. Freedom does not mean that nothing can harm you. It means that fear no longer possesses the final word. The walls in this story are imaginary, but the prison is not. People remain in lives they claim to hate because the pain is familiar. They remain in patterns that weaken them because change would demand effort. They remain among people who corrupt them because rejection feels worse than compromise. They continue lying because one honest sentence might dismantle the identity built from 1,000 dishonest ones. They wait for permission, for certainty, for motivation, for someone else to go first. And while they wait, repetition becomes habit. Habit becomes character. Character begins to feel like fate. But the fact that a prison was built slowly does not mean it cannot be left. The first act of freedom may be small, telling the truth once, refusing one compromise, ending one destructive routine, taking one step that the group does not understand. Freedom begins when a person stops asking whether fear is present and begins asking whether fear deserves obedience. The prisoners had spent decades demanding liberation from an enclosure that required only one thing to survive: their continued agreement to remain inside. The gate was open. It had always been open. The final question was never whether they could leave. It was whether they were willing to become responsible for where they went next.